It was a Tuesday morning in the second week of October, 1987, and the sky above the Dellard place sat the color of old pewter, flat and close, the kind of sky that made every sound feel muffled and near. I remember the exact temperature because I had checked the thermometer nailed to the barn post when I came out at 6, and it read 31 degrees, 1 degree below freezing, and yet the ground had not hardened, not even close. The mud along the fence line still pulled at my boots the way it had all through September. I remember that detail because of what Clyde Orman said to me that same morning, standing at the gate with his coffee still steaming in his hand, looking at the pen where those 8 hogs were laid out like they were already gone. He looked at me, then at the hogs, then back at me, and he said, flat as paper, "Marta, you paid $25 apiece for animals that are going to be dead before Thanksgiving." He did not say it to be cruel. He said it the way a man states a fact he considers obvious. That is what I remember about that morning. The pewter sky, the boot-sucking mud, and the flat certainty in Clyde Orman's voice. And I remember it precisely because he was almost right, and almost is, where all the real work lives. By the way, wherever in the world you're watching from right now, let me know in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories reach. Okay, where were we? I had come to the Dellard homestead the year before, in the spring of 1986, by way of an arrangement that people around Harlan County were still not entirely comfortable with. My name is Marta Voss. I was 38 years old. I had come from a farming family in a rural part of eastern Minnesota, and I had answered an advertisement placed by a man named Gerald Dellard, who was 54, who needed a wife and a working partner, and who was honest enough in his letter to say that the place was in trouble, and that he did not want a companion who would be surprised by that fact later. Gerald was a plain and serious man. I was a plain and serious woman. We corresponded for 5 months before I took the bus down. I will say nothing more about the personal arrangement than that, except that it was practical, and became, in time, something more than practical, and that Gerald died of a stroke in the January of 1990, which is a different story entirely. The story I am telling you now is about the hogs, and about a method I found in a water-stained ledger, and about a piece of ground that everyone, including me, had read as useless, until the ground itself corrected us. The Dellard homestead was 212 acres in a creek-bottom valley, with the good ground rising to the east, and the wet ground, the difficult ground, spreading across the lowest 40 acres along the west fence. That 40 acres had a name among the older families in the county. They called it the Seep. Gerald's father had called it the Seep. Gerald's grandfather had ditched it in 1931, spent $60 and 11 days of labor driving clay tile through it, and gotten 3 seasons of marginal oat crop before the tile collapsed under the weight of a wet spring and the Seep returned to being the Seep. Gerald himself had tried twice, once in 1968 with rented drainage equipment that cost him $400 and left the ground serviceable for exactly 2 years. Once in 1974 with a different approach involving raised beds and creek gravel fill that held for 1 season before the water table rose in a wet August and drowned everything he had planted. By the time I arrived in 1986, the Seep was simply a cost, a piece of ground you walked around, a reminder that some problems are not problems to be solved, but facts to be respected. What I did not know, and what Gerald had apparently either forgotten or chosen not to mention, was that his father's father, a man named August Dellard, who had homesteaded the original 120 acres in 1903, had kept a ledger. Not a farm account ledger, though it had some of that in it. A working ledger. A record of what he had tried, what had failed, what he had observed, and what he thought those observations meant. The ledger was in a wooden crate under the workbench in the old equipment shed, underneath a folded piece of burlap, underneath a Maxwell House coffee can full of bent square-head nails. I found it in October of 1986, a full year before the morning with the sick hogs. when I was cleaning out the shed to make room for the tractor Gerald had traded for. It was wrapped in a piece of oilcloth that had kept it dry enough to read, though the bottom right corner of every page had wicked moisture and the ink there had gone to shadow. August Dellard had written in a cramped, careful hand, and he had dated most entries the way a methodical man does, with the day and the month and the year, and sometimes the time. The entry that stopped me was dated the 14th of August, 1911. It read as follows, and I am giving you his words exactly as I have read them perhaps 40 times over the years. He wrote, "The low ground is not broken ground. It is ground that has not yet been asked the right question. Hogs asked it for me. 3 seasons running, what was seep is now sod. I did not drain the wet from the land. I let the land drain itself, and the hogs were the instrument of it. A man who fights the wet will lose every time. A man who puts the wet to work will find he has more land than he started with." Then below that, in the same careful hand, a single additional line. "Patience is not the same as waiting. Patience is watching with purpose." I read that entry twice standing in the shed with the light going orange through the dusty window. Then I set the ledger down on the bench and did not pick it up again for almost a full year. Not because I dismissed it, because I did not yet understand it well enough to trust it. That is a distinction worth making. There is a difference between not believing a thing and not yet being ready for it. The hogs arrived in my readiness in the fall of 1987, though not by my design. Gerald had bought them in late September from a farm sale 3 counties east, 8 shoats of a heritage breed that ran heavier and rougher than the commercial breeds, animals with coarser hair and wider snouts, and a reputation for being hard to manage but hard to kill. He had paid $25 apiece for them, $200 total, because the selling farmer was dispersing and needed them gone before the weather turned. Gerald had meant them for the east pens, the dry pens, and he had put them there. Within 2 weeks, 4 of the 8 were showing signs of respiratory illness, a deep rattling cough and a listlessness that made them stand with their heads low and their ears slack. By the first week of October, all 8 showed the same signs to some degree, and the county extension agent who came out looked at them and said what extension agents sometimes say, which is that the prognosis was uncertain, that medication was available, but costly relative to the animal's current value, and that Gerald might consider cutting his losses. Gerald was not a man who cut losses easily. He stood there with his hands in his pockets and said nothing for a long time. Then he looked at me. That night I went back to the equipment shed and I took out August Dellard's ledger. I read the August 1911 entry again. Then I read backward and forward from it, looking for the practical detail that must have been there, and I found it across several entries from the summers of 1909 through 1911. August had not described a trick. He had described a system. The hogs, specifically a rough heritage breed he called his bog runners, had been rotated through the wet low ground in a deliberate sequence, moved every 10 to 14 days, their rooting and their weight, and their particular manner of working ground, doing something that August described only in result terms. The water found new channels, the compacted wet clay was broken and aerated by the rooting, and over 3 seasons the wet ground had developed enough subsurface structure that it began to drain itself between wet periods rather than pooling and holding. He had not drained the seep. The hogs had restructured it. There was more in the later entries. He had noted that the animals themselves seemed to improve when moved to the wet ground. He wrote in November of 1909 that animals he had considered poor prospects had grown visibly healthier after 2 weeks on the low pasture, and his theory, written plainly and without certainty, was that the root systems and the mineral content of the wet ground forage were doing something that his dry lot feed did not do. He did not claim to know what. He only wrote what he saw. That was the quality I respected in August Dellard's ledger more than anything else. He did not explain past what he had actually seen. I told Gerald what I had found the next morning at the kitchen table. I laid the ledger open to the August 1911 entry and let him read it. He read it once, then read it again more slowly, and then he closed the ledger and set both hands flat on the cover. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "The seep." Not a question, a recognition. I said, "Yes." He said, "My father said that ground ruined everything that touched it." I said that August had thought different. Gerald picked up his coffee cup and looked at the window for a while. Then he said, "It would not cost anything we don't already have." That was Gerald's way of saying yes. We moved the hogs to the seep on the 12th of October, 1987, not all 40 acres. We fenced a section of roughly 8 acres in the northeast corner of the seep, where August's ledger showed his first rotation had begun, using existing fence posts where they still stood and driving new ones where they had rotted with woven wire we had on a partial roll in the shed and about $40 of new material from the co-op. The hogs did not like being moved. They complained loudly about it, in the way hogs do, a sustained and indignant chorus that Clyde Orman could surely hear from his place a quarter-mile north. I did not go explain myself to Clyde. The sick animals were difficult to move, and we moved them slowly, Gerald on one side and I on the other, with sorting boards, taking the better part of a morning to get all 8 through the gate and into the new section. Within 3 days I noticed the first change. I had been watching them twice daily, morning and late afternoon, standing at the fence for 10 to 15 minutes each visit, and writing down what I saw in a plain composition notebook I bought at the hardware store in town for 69 cents. What I noticed on the 3rd day was that 4 of the 8 animals were rooting actively, which they had not done in the east pens. 2 more joined the active group by day 5. By day 8, all 8 animals were moving through the wet ground, pushing their wide, flat snouts into the mud along the seep channels, working the root mats at the margins of the standing water areas, moving with a purpose and an energy they had not shown since Gerald brought them home. The coughing did not stop immediately. It lessened first in the 2 largest animals, then gradually in the others over the following 2 weeks. By the end of October, 5 weeks after they had looked like animals bound for an early burial, 7 of the 8 were sound. The 8th carried a residual wheeze through the winter, but was functional and ate well. I am not saying the wet ground cured sick hogs. I am saying that those 8 animals on that ground, in that sequence, improved in a way that the east pens had not produced. And I recorded what I saw rather than what I could explain. August Dellard had done the same thing 78 years before me, and I thought that was worth noting. What I did not anticipate was the county. In early November of 1987, a man from the County Land Use Office drove out to look at what we were doing. He had received, he said, a concern from a neighboring property regarding potential water table contamination from hog operation in a low-lying drainage area. He did not say whose concern it was. He walked the fence line with a clipboard, measured the distance from our fence to the creek with a tape measure, wrote down several numbers, and told us we might be in violation of a setback ordinance that governed hog operations within 300 feet of a named waterway. Our nearest fence corner was 260 feet from the near bank of Perkins Creek at its closest seasonal channel. He left a written notice that required us to respond within 30 days. Gerald went very quiet when he read that notice. He sat at the table with it for a long time, and I let him sit. Eventually I said we should get the ledger and see what August had to say, and I meant it partly as practical and partly as steadying. And Gerald understood it that way. We looked at the 1911 entry again. August had not been within any legal setback, of course, but he had noted that his hog rotation was kept well clear of the creek bank, which was his own standard. not a law's. Our fence was at 260 feet from the seasonal channel, but the seasonal channel was not the named waterway under the ordinance. The named waterway, Perkins Creek proper, ran at its closest point 340 feet from our fence at that corner, a fact I had to establish by walking it with a measuring wheel I borrowed from the co-op, walking it on a cold, gray morning in mid-November with my breath showing in the air, marking the distance in 30-foot increments with wooden stakes and a length of baler twine. 340 feet. We were clear of the ordinance. I wrote that response myself with the measurements attached and mailed it to the county office. The matter was closed by letter in early December. But the time it took and the energy it took and the uncertainty of those 30 days wore on me in a way I did not entirely expect. I am not a person who flags easily. I had come a long way from Minnesota, from a different life, and I had not come to flag. But there were nights in November when I sat with the ledger and felt the weight of it all pressing down at once. The sick hogs, the wet ground, the ordinance notice, the memory of Clyde Orman's voice saying what he had said in early October. On one of those nights I read the August 1911 entry a fourth time, maybe a fifth time, I cannot say exactly, and I came back to August's last line as though I had not read it before. Patience is not the same as waiting. Patience is watching with purpose. I wrote that line in the front cover of my composition notebook that night in my own hand, underneath the date, so that I would see it every time I opened the notebook to write down what I had observed that day. The method is the watching. That is what I was reminding myself. By December, the ground inside the fenced section was visibly different from the seep outside it. I do not mean transformed. I mean visibly, measurably different in specific ways. The standing water that had been present in 3 low spots within the section when we fenced it in October had receded by a measured amount. I probed the depth of the surface mud at 4 marked points along the north edge using a steel rod with inch marks I had scratched into it with a file, probing to resistance and recording the number. In October, those probes had gone to between 9 and 13 inches before hitting resistance. By the first week of December, they were going to between 5 and 7 inches at the same marked points. The hogs had not drained the ground, they had opened it. The rooting had broken the surface compaction, and the weight of the animals moving through it had, over 8 weeks, restructured the micro-drainage channels in a way that let the water move rather than pool. The change was not dramatic, but the change was real, and it was consistent at all 4 probe points, and I had the numbers to show it. We rotated the hogs out of the first section on the 14th of December into a second fenced section of roughly 6 acres adjacent to the first, following what August had described in his 1910 entries, moving animals to fresh ground before the first section was cut over entirely, giving the broken open ground a chance to establish some root cover through the following season before it was worked again. The first section, left to rest, began to show new grass along the rooting edges by the following April, a fine-bladed, tough-rooted grass that I did not recognize, and that the county extension agent, when he finally came back for a follow-up visit in the spring of 1988, also did not immediately recognize. He bent down and pulled a small section of it up by the roots and looked at the root structure for a long time without speaking. That visit, the spring 1988 visit, is the one I want to tell you about carefully, because it is the one that mattered in the way that outside confirmation matters. His name was Dennis Farwell, and he was perhaps 32 years old, recently placed by the State Extension Service, and he carried with him a field soil testing kit, and a moisture meter, and a notebook of his own. And he had come back because our December response to the county ordinance notice had apparently been thorough enough to prompt someone to schedule a follow-up site review, and Farwell had drawn that assignment. He was not hostile, he was thorough, which is not the same thing but can feel similar when you are the one being measured. He walked the first section, the one the hogs had worked from October through December, and he took soil cores at 6 points using a tube auger he pulled from a canvas bag and he ran his moisture meter at those same 6 points, and he wrote numbers in his notebook. He walked outside the fenced area to the untouched seep ground and took 6 more cores and 6 more moisture readings at comparable points, and he wrote those down too. He spent perhaps an hour and 40 minutes on the property in total, and he said very little during that time. I did not fill his silence. I followed at a respectful distance and let him work. When he was done, he came back to where I was standing near the gate, and he looked at his notebook for a while. Then he said, "There's a measurable difference in compaction and moisture retention between the worked section and the unworked section. The worked section is showing subsurface porosity values I wouldn't expect from a natural drainage improvement in this time frame." He paused. He looked at the ground and then back at his notebook. He said, "What breed were the hogs?" I told him, and described their size and weight, animals in the range of 200 to 240 pounds each at their heaviest. He wrote that down. He looked at the grass along the old rooting edges. He said, "I can't account for this rate of change by any mechanism I'd ordinarily apply to this soil profile." He said it plainly, with no dramatic quality to it, just a man reading his numbers aloud and acknowledging what they did not explain. Then he asked if he could come back in another season to take additional readings, and I said yes, and that was essentially the end of the conversation. He did come back. In the fall of 1988, and again in the spring of 1989. He brought a colleague the second time, a soil scientist from the State University, who took his own cores and ran his own measurements, and who, by the end of his visit, had used the phrase "significant improvement in infiltration rate" twice in the same paragraph of notes, which I could see him writing as he crouched over his sample bag. Neither of them offered a conventional explanation for the rate of change they were measuring. What they offered instead was the data, and the data said the seep was different than it had been, meaningfully and measurably different, at every point where the hogs had worked. By the fall of 1989, 2 full seasons after we had started, we had rotated the hogs through 22 of the 40 seep acres in 3 successive sections. The first section had been rested, revegetated, and was holding a stand of rough mixed grass that Gerald described, one evening while we were walking it, as the best ground cover he had seen on that 40 acres in his memory. That is a careful statement. Not the best ground, the best cover. The standing water in the worked sections was consistently lower in duration and extent than in the unworked portions, and the unworked portions still pooled after every significant rain the way they always had. The contrast was legible to anyone who walked the fence line, no instruments required. Clyde Orman walked that fence line in September of 1989, uninvited but not unwelcome, on a bright morning when the light was going yellow and clean across the valley. He walked slowly and said nothing for a good while. Then he stopped and looked at the worked ground and then at the seep beyond it, and he said, "Your ground drains better." He did not say it as a question or as a concession. He said it as a flat observation, the same flat delivery he had used in October of 1987 when he told me I had paid good money for animals about to die. I did not respond except to nod. His observation sat in the air between us, and we let it sit. The winter numbers for that first year, 1987 going into 1988, were what they were, and I will give them to you without decoration. The 8 hogs, which had cost $200 total, made it through the winter. 7 were fully sound by January. We sold 5 of them the following spring at prices between $60 and $80 a head, depending on weight, and kept 3 for breeding purposes, intending to expand the rotation herd the following fall, which we did, adding 4 more animals purchased for a total of $90. The financial return on that first year was not a windfall. It was a recovery of the initial cost and a modest surplus, enough to cover the fence materials and the measuring wheel rental and the notebook I had filled with observations. What the financial numbers do not capture is the ground itself. 22 acres of the seep, by the time Gerald died in January of 1990, were productive in a way they had not been in the living memory of anyone in that valley. Dennis Farwell, in his final site visit in November of 1989, had written in the summary he sent to us afterward that the infiltration rate improvement across the worked sections represented, in his professional estimation, the equivalent of what a conventional subsurface drainage system might achieve over a similar period at a cost of between $4,000 and $6,000 per affected acre, a number he framed carefully with the phrase rough comparative estimate, but a number he put in writing nonetheless. I had August Dellard's ledger rebind by a woman in town who did bookbinding as a trade, a neat and solid rebind in new board covers, and I placed it in the fireproof box where Gerald kept the deed and the insurance papers. That seemed like the right place for it. August had written something useful and true, and he had written it carefully, and it had waited in a coffee-stained oilcloth for 76 years for someone to be ready to read it slowly enough to hear it. I thought it deserved to be kept with the documents that established what the land was and who it belonged to, because in a real and practical sense, August's record was part of that establishment. People have asked me, in the years since, what I think the Hogs actually did to that ground, the mechanical question, and I can tell you what I observed and what Farwell and his colleague measured: broken compaction, restructured surface drainage, improved subsurface porosity, colonization by tough-rooted grass species that stabilize the opened ground. The how of it is a physical process that soil scientists have language for. What I do not have is certainty about why the animals improved when they were moved to the wet ground, the health question, and I will not pretend to have answered that. I saw what I saw. August saw what he saw, nearly 80 years before me. We both wrote it down. What I do know is this: August Dellard had written that patience is not the same as waiting, that patience is watching, with purpose. I have turned that line over in my mind many times in the years since that October morning in 1987. The pewter sky and the boot-sucking mud, and Clyde Orman's coffee cup steaming in the cold air. The 8 sick hogs laid out in the east pen, the ledger under the burlap under the coffee can. All of it was already there. The method was already there. The ground had been waiting in its own way for the right question. It had been waiting since August walked away from it in 1911, when whatever came next dissolved his system into forgetting. What the land needed was not a better machine or a deeper tile or a more expensive intervention. It needed the question that August had already found and written down and left, in plain and careful language, for whoever came along next who was patient enough to read it slowly. I am not a person who came to that valley with credentials or with a reputation or with anything much except a willingness to look at hard things plainly and to write down what I saw. I have made my share of errors on that ground. I have misread seasons and misjudged animals and spent money on things that did not earn their cost back. I do not hold any of that differently than I hold the good results. Both are honest. Both are data. The ledger I kept through those years, the 69-cent composition notebooks, 12 of them in total by the time the SEEP rotation was complete, are in the same fireproof box as August's ledger now. I thought they belonged together, one record building on another across the distance of decades, the way good information moves when it is written down honestly and kept somewhere dry. If you have a piece of difficult ground or a difficult problem that has beaten everyone who tried the direct approach, I would ask you only this: is there an old record somewhere in a shed or a box or the back of a drawer written by someone who was there before you and who took the time to write what they saw rather than what they could explain? Because that is worth more than most people think, and it waits longer than most people expect. Leave me a comment and tell me about your stubborn ground, or your old record, or the thing that everybody told you was already decided. I would like to hear it. Patience is not the same as waiting. August knew that. Took me a while to learn it for myself, but the learning held.